You're a wizard, Harry. Those words were spoken to a little boy who seemed to have almost nothing. He was an 11-year-old orphan, and he lived in a small closet under the stairway of his aunt and uncle's home. And yet, because he was willing to do what was in front of him, he became the greatest hero his world had ever known. And the thing is, you're a hero. Each and every one of you. You are all heroes. You're the heroes of your own story. The heroes of your own journey. I know sometimes in life it becomes tempting to be a victim. It becomes tempting to think that life is happening to us. It becomes tempting to go to sleep and let somebody else write for a while. You know? But the truth is, we have the power. We are the authors. We are the wizards of our own journeys. So, for the next several weeks, I'm going to be leading us through something that in my mind I've been calling Harry Potter and the Hero's Journey. What I really want everyone to understand is that this is about your journey, because you're a hero. You may wonder, why are we talking about this in church? Right? What does this have to do with church? So, for those of you that take notes, the first point that I'm going to make today is one I call myth perception. Yeah, myth perception. You can say that very quickly, right? I'm also going to talk about something I call it's the same story, and finally, it's all about that soul. But myth perception is something that we have struggled with, many of us, in the Christian tradition for a couple thousand years now. When I first met Alice Anderson, who is one of my mentors and came here in April when we kicked off a series based on one of her books, I was on the board at Christ Church Unity in Orlando, and we were interviewing her. And during the short weekend we had, I asked her, among other questions, I said, what is your Christology? In other words, tell me what you think about who Jesus was. And she thought about it for a minute, and she said, well, I don't want to take anybody's Jesus away from them. And you know, that's a very good sentiment, and it's one that I can agree with. But what I'm left with, as someone who grew up in a Baptist church and never could believe what the people around me believed, and couldn't find a Jesus that made sense to me, or that spoke to me, or that healed me. What I came to, now that I have become a minister, is that one of my jobs is to help people who've never had a Jesus that worked for them find one. And people who have been harmed by the Bible to find a Bible that works for them. And that's what we are here to do today and over the next several weeks. But it will require that we work with a new understanding of what the Bible actually is. I have a stack of books next to me, and these are some of my source material for the next 7 weeks. And of course, I have all the Harry Potter books. And I have my study Bible. And I also have Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And we're going to really dig into some of Joseph Campbell's works. But one of the books that I want to reference is Who Wrote the New Testament? And the subtitle may trigger some of you. So this is your trigger warning, all of you new folks. The subtitle of this, Who Wrote the New Testament, is The Making of the Christian Myth. And as the author Burton Mack says, that early Christians engaged in myth-making may be difficult for modern Christians to accept. But that is, in fact, the case. Much of what has been handed down to us in this book is myth. And what I want you to hear me say is that is not saying that it's not the truth. You see, in our postmodern society and Western culture, we have this misunderstanding that if something can't be quantified scientifically, it's not valid. If it can't be measured, if it can't be quantified, it's not real. But the ancients had a larger understanding of the universe than that. And what they understood is that truth very often comes in stories that didn't necessarily happen exactly that way. One of my favorite illustrations in America has to do with George Washington. Okay, George Washington crossed the Delaware, right? We've got that painting of him, on the boat with his knee up in the air and, like going that way. How many of you remember what George Washington said to his sergeant major right before they got in the boat? Okay. George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. How many of you remember what he said when he got caught chopping down the cherry tree? All right? I cannot tell a lie, right? Here's the thing. George Washington actually crossed the Delaware. That actually happened. But George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree. The story about him chopping down a cherry tree simply illustrates something, that integrity and honesty are important, particularly in someone who's going to be the president of the United States. And that's all I'm going to say about that. But that myth has become part of our American culture, and we continue to learn from it today. In the past, in the deep past, stories were how people transmitted the culture from generation to generation, how they grew their culture. And myth essentially was the thread of truth that ran through that culture. It was, when we think of stories and we want to look for the moral of the story. So a myth is more than just a story. It is a story with a moral. It is a story that teaches us. It is a story that reveals a larger truth regardless of whether or not it actually happened. Nobody asked Jesus when he was telling his parables, hey, what was that Samaritan's name? Right? They understood he was telling a story to illustrate a larger truth. Nobody asked him, hey, what was the name of the guy that, gave his talents to his employees? Or where was that field that dude found that pearl? I want one of those. Nobody said that. Because they understood that Jesus' parables were designed to tell us something about ourselves. So myth has the power to reveal things that fact does not. Joseph Campbell, in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, says that it would not be too much to say that myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into the human cultural manifestation. Religions, philosophies, arts, the social forms of primitive and historic man prime discoveries in science and technology, the very dreams that blister sleep, boil up from the basic magic ring of myth. So, myth is not less than the truth. It's not less important. It deserves our respect, and in some cases, even our reverence. So, for those people who have in the past found this book just as difficult to believe as these books, that's okay. You can still learn something from all of them. So one thing that we want to look at is, what is it that they all have in common? Well, essentially, what Joseph Campbell came to is that they're all telling the same story. They're telling our story. And he came to a term that he has for it called the monomyth, right? Joseph studied dozens of cultures, hundreds of stories. And he came down to one story that happens over and over again. It's been told in stories from as far back as we have records. And it's being told today every time we go to the movies, every time we turn on the television, every time we open a new book, we're reading the same story. I'm going to unpack the real specifics of that story over the next few weeks, but the short version of it is about a journey. And each of us takes many journeys in our lives, but in one very real sense, we have one journey that arcs all the way across. Harry's story in the Harry Potter books is very similar. This journey, and it's a three-part journey. It starts with a separation, and then that person, that character, that hero, Harry, in his case, goes through some kind of an initiation. And then there is a return. Now, there is a story arc that goes across all 7 of those books. That is one separation, initiation, and return. And you could also see it in each one of the books. In pretty much every book, he starts off being separated from his life with the non-magical people. He goes off into the world of magic. He is initiated yet again. And then he returns at the end of the school year. So it is for us. You know, we have many different iterations of that story in our lives, and yet there is a part of us that is doing one long journey. That part of us is our soul. The hero's journey is universal because it's nothing more or less than our soul's journey told over and over again in a million creative ways. And there are a lot of different pieces that seem familiar because we all share so many familiar things. The word that has come up for those familiar places, those familiar characters, those familiar events that come up along the way is archetype. There are archetypal characters in our dreams, in our lives. There are archetypal events that happen, and they happen over and over again. One of the things that we can do when we look at our lives, when we look at what's going on, is we can look for those archetypes, those signposts, and we can relate them to things in the Bible, to things in Harry Potter, to things in Star Wars, to things in anything else that we may need to get a clue as to what is this here to teach me, and what is mine to do next from this place in the journey, because there is a next leg of the journey to go to. One of the other things that Joseph says that I think really points to the idea that this is not just a story about Agamemnon, it's not just a story about Jesus, it's not just a story about Harry Potter, it's not just a story about Luke Skywalker, is he says, we have only to follow, therefore, a multitude of heroic figures through the classic stages of the universal adventure in order to see again what has always been revealed. This will help us to understand not only the meaning of those images for contemporary life, but also the singleness of the human spirit in its aspirations, powers, vicissitudes, and wisdom. The singleness of the human spirit. That is really the key to it all. We really are all one. We really all do have that one story. We are separated, we are initiated, and we return. And at the level of our soul, when we look at this entire life that we live as our soul's journey, at some point at birth or prior to that, we could sit and talk all day about which way that goes. But at some point, our soul has separated from oneness with God, with Spirit. This life is an initiation. And we go through the trials and tribulations that a hero goes through. One thing common to the hero's journey is that there will be trials, right? We could all talk about those. But there are also overcomings. There are lessons that are learned. We grow in power and stature. And then we go home. We return. So, for us, the question that we can ask ourselves is, how do I make the most of it? How do I learn this time around? How do I make sure that this journey is a hero's journey and not someone just sleepwalking through an incarnation? So as time goes by, over these next few weeks, we're going to look at some of the stages of the hero's journey and some of the things that happens. It is when we look that deeply within and think, what is my soul here to do? Why did I come here? What am I doing? Have I grown? Sometimes it feels so huge. And it's hard to feel like a hero. It seems like it would simply be easier to just give up. But the reason we tell these stories, the reason that we remind ourselves that a little kid could learn enough to save all of his friends and everyone in his world from a huge evil. The reason that we keep telling that story over and over again is to get that lonely little soul that was separated from all that is through this very long journey. What are some very long nights? We all have these dark nights of the soul. But the important thing to remember is that there is something beyond that. these commonalities that we find in the different journeys that take place. Being born in either mysterious circumstances or poverty. Jesus being born in a stable. And, of course, having some mythical origin. It is so common to the stories of the day. But it's the same for our soul. We know our soul came from God, but we don't quite know how. We can't quite understand it. Harry's ability to do magic, it was something given to him, but it was hidden. And it is the same for each of us. We all have hidden abilities. We don't know where they came from. And yet, in some way, something about our journey will call those abilities forth. I look at my own life, and I know that had I not had the issues that I've had I not been in recovery, I would not have found the relationship I have with Spirit, and I certainly wouldn't be standing here doing what I'm doing today. It is really the villains of our stories, the Herods, the Voldemorts, the Darth Vaders, who make us who we are. They are our teachers as much as they are the villains of our stories. They inspire us and move us forward. We become greater than we would have become. Modern life has rushed towards convenience. If any of you are familiar with the movie WALL-E, right? It's a animated movie, and it's really a love story between a little garbage collector and robot and another robot that is sent out to find biological organisms. And it's very cute. But what it has to say about humanity and where we're headed is not particularly flattering. Humanity in this movie has completely trashed the world. They've all jumped onto spaceships, and they're now wandering around the galaxy. All the people are overweight. They lay around in these floating beds watching TV, drinking milkshakes, putting forth absolutely zero effort. For most of the movie, they're not very heroic. But at the very end of it, when they end up crashing back on Earth and they have to roll themselves off of their carts, they start losing weight, they stop drinking the milkshakes, and they become heroes too. So even those of us who may have been asleep for a very long time or very deeply can be awakened to the hero that each and every one of us is. The thing that we have to remember is that even though we may not be able to pull out a wand and cast a spell, there's magic in each one of us. Just as we may not feel like trying to walk on water or turn water into wine today, but each one of us is the Christ, whole and perfect. And that's not a myth. Please join me in prayer. Sweet Spirit, we are deeply grateful for all of the storytellers in our lives, all those who have handed down to us the inspiration to become the heroes that we truly are. For their imaginations, their willingness to put their own hearts out into stories, and for their ability to transform our lives and our spirits. We say thank you. Thank you, God. So it is.